This is Kolk presenting on King Leonidas for the winter semester of 2021 of the Western Civilization to 1500 class. Before I dive into King Leonidas, I want to take a look at their government style. Sparta was a militaristic oligarchy. It did have some components of a monarchy because they had kings. They had two separate kings and different bodies of lawmakers and different courts, making it more of an oligarchy than a traditional monarchy. They had many levels to their system, at the very bottom being the helots. This was a race of enslaved people who they kept at the bottom and did everything they could in their power to keep them there. That was the main reason why Sparta was seen as militaristic. Their whole life revolved around keeping the helots down. This translated onto the battlefield at many different times. I wanted to show where Sparta was among the Greek city-states. As you can see, it is near the center of the map, very south on the map as well. You can see Argos and Mezzanine are the neighboring city-states to it. So who was King Leonidas? King Leonidas was the king of the Spartan people during times of war between the First and Second Persian Wars. He was an elite warrior in battle, and an interesting fact about him is that it is speculated his lineage is traced back to Hercules, the mythological hero. As I said before, Leonidas was king from 490 BCE to 480 BCE when he died. 490 BCE was near the end of the First Persian War with King Darius, and he ended up dying during the Second Persian War, during possibly one of the most famous Greek battles to ever exist. And that's why I have the second point of him saying the majority of his reign was surrounded in war. So, as I said before, it was rumored that the two kings of Sparta were the descendants of the mythological heroes Hercules and the god Apollo. In the bottom right-hand corner, I have a picture of Hercules, who it is said that King Leonidas was descended from. But there were two families that passed their lineage down and stayed the rulers and were the kings of Sparta. Those were the two kings that I mentioned earlier. So, in King Leonidas' early years, he was not first in line to be the king. And so, because of that, he didn't prepare himself to become king. The only person who was prepared was the king's firstborn son. And so instead of doing that, all Greek boys started training to become warriors at 7 years old in the agoge. The agoge was most comparable to our K through 12 system in school right now. as in they taught children and provided them throughout the younger years of life. But it was far different in the ways that they achieved this goal. It was actually a very rough and tumble kind of life being in the Agoge. Starting out, you would form bands of like people and go throughout your life, your early life, with these people not having shoes and only having one cloak per year to train in. This was seen as a way to make you tougher and to get you used to being in the army. They also were not fed extremely well. They were kept out of malnutrition, but their general idea was that a hungry soldier would fight harder than a fat and lazy soldier. Later on, in those bands or clubs or groups of boys would select a sort of leader for them, and that would be an Aaron. It is speculated that King Leonidas was one of these Aarons. Basically, they led that group. They were seen as the strongest, smartest, and most capable in there. And the reason it's speculated that he was one of these Aarons is that he showed great prowess on the battlefield, as well as being the son of a king, which certainly would factor into him being selected for this role. So it was actually very interesting how Leonidas came to be king, as is he wasn't the first or even second in line for it. There were some rather unfortunate events that led to him being selected as king. His oldest brother, Cleomenes, was king before him, directly before him, and he tried taking over the neighboring city-states, and that didn't go over well with the majority of Spartan people, as well as the neighboring tribes. So they ended up exiling him for this. And while he was exiled, he began to form groups of soldiers to come with him, and they ended up taking him out of exile to bring him into the city. But when they did that, they locked him up and put him in jail. And while he was in jail, he actually committed suicide by convincing one of the Helot guards to give him a knife. And with that, he cut himself up from the legs up, just all over until he bled out, which is a extremely brutal suicide. Another interesting fact about Cleomenes is that his daughter would end up marrying Leonidas, which is a slightly strange relationship, but not uncommon in the past. Things like that would happen from time to time throughout history. So, in the beginning of King Leonidas' reign, or not the beginning, towards the end of King Leonidas' reign, the Second Persian War began. This was King Xerxes' payback towards the Greek city-states for his father's failure before in trying to take over. Also, it was another way to get back at Athens for their involvement in trying to free other Greek city-states from the control of the Persians. So, in the beginning, King Xerxes sent out messengers to all the Greek city-states that were left remaining to ask them to give up and not fight in a battle with him, and he would give them a slightly lesser punishment than if they fought. And this was a pretty famous scene in the movie 300, where King Leonidas kicked the messenger into a well, and that is not exactly how the historians put it down. There was some extra theatrics added into that to make the movie more interesting, but it is actually partially true, where they threw the messenger into a well when he came in to give them the message from King Xerxes. So, most of King Leonidas's legacy was from right here at the Battle of Thermopylae. As you can see from the picture, from the sea to the mountain range, it was only 49 feet wide. And this is where the majority of the fighting at the Battle of Thermopylae was contained to. But before the altercation occurred, some scouts were sent out to go look and see what the Spartans were doing. And they saw some rather odd things that the Spartans were doing that they didn't quite understand. It was said that the Spartans were naked, exercising, and braiding each other's hair before the fight. And they thought that they had gone crazy. They thought that they went delusional before this fight that they thought was going to be a complete blowout. They would just be wiped away, so they were going crazy from this thought of what was going to happen. But it was quite the opposite. An insider in the Persian army told them that this was how they were preparing to fight them before their very last battle. So the Spartans did have some advantages in this fight. The first being the armor and weapons they had. Second, the military experience they had. And the strategies they used. So let's head into the armor and weapons. So for this battle, the two sides had very different types of armor and weapons. The Spartans had heavy bronze and wooden inlaid shields, while the Persians had wicker shields, as you can see on the right side. These were not near as strong and could be easily beaten in close quarters combat, as well as the actual armor that they both had were similarly differing in strength. The Persians had either leather or cloth armor that was easily penetrated by the weapons of the Spartans, where they had a bronze leafed spear with a point at the end that they could use in their phalanx formation to drive in and basically obliterate any of the forces put before them because of the weakness of their gear. The second factor was the experience. Leonidas brought with him the 300. They were basically the king's bodyguards. They were the best of the best. They were the most experienced, most well-trained in their positions. They were also known as cavalrymen based on their name, but they did not actually ride horses, which is a little bit ironic. As well as King Leonidas had his own background in fighting. He had spent from age 7 on upwards in hoplite training, where he learned all about fighting and strategy. So he was not lacking in this department. Their strategy reigned supreme in this battle. It's why they could take out as many Persians as they did. They forced the Persians into a weak position, much like in the Battle of Marathon, where Athens funneled the Persians into their fight. The Spartans made the point of attack in a narrow pass, as you saw earlier, that 49-foot gap in between the ocean and the mountain wall. There was no getting around. They could only go through the Spartans, which was not happening based on the tenacity of the Spartan army and the fact of how much better their weapons and armor were than the Persians. The Persian strategy was to use archers, and their bow and arrows weren't effective against the Spartans' armor. They couldn't pierce it, and when they did fire at them, they used that phalanx formation to block themselves up so they didn't have casualties from it. And when they got close to the archers of the Persian side, they could easily destroy them just because of the type of armor and weapons they had. They just couldn't match up against them. And as they killed all these Persians, they started stacking up their bodies and making a wall to intimidate the other Persians, make them wonder and fear seeing all these dead comrades they had going into this battle. It would really mess with you. And another thing they did is the Spartans retreated and then charged back, messing with the minds of the Persians and really like baited them into being into positions where they wouldn't want to be. This is the reason why people consider that the Spartans were the winners of this battle, even though they were wiped out from it. So, when talking about Xerxes' army, there were some accounts that said there were about 2.5 million soldiers that came with him to this on his trek into Greece, but there are many different articles and research that say that was actually only about 250,000 soldiers, which is still quite a bit for the time period and much more than the amount that the Greek city-states had to fight with. And another advantage that the Persians had is that they had advanced battleships for the time period. And I'll go into the next slide about that. The Persian battleships were very advanced. They had a bronze tip at the end of it that they used to ram into other ships to try and sink them. But more importantly, they just tried to get close to the smaller and not as well manned vessels and get on board and take control of the other side's ships. And as you can see from the Battle of Salamis, that this didn't work out for the Persians. These boats weren't always as reliable as the Spartan the Athenian fleets. During bad or inclement weather, these ships didn't fare as well. They just could not hold up to the immense pounding that the weather brought on them. And that was part of the reason why the Athenians could win on the sea, is their quicker, more agile ships could surround and take down these larger ships and render them ineffective. And that is part of why the Battle of Thermopylae was also important. The Battle of Thermopylae held up the land forces of Xerxes, while the Athenians could take down the ships. It really separated them. But in the end, the Spartans did not end up defeating Xerxes' army on land. Well, they put up an amazing fight, maybe had the most casualties in comparison to their own seen in ancient times. But there was a traitor on, he was a native to Greece, who switched sides because the Persian king Xerxes offered a reward of a king's salary, of a king's treasure, to these to anybody who could help them defeat the Spartans, that's how the tale goes. And Leonidas told him of a path, a goat path that led through the wilderness and around, that could go to the back of where the Spartans were, so they could surround and conquer them. But the impact of the 300 did not go unnoticed. It bought a lot of time for the city of Athens to evacuate, so they didn't have any civilian casualties from the invasion when they got through, as well as the Spartans just completely decimated half of the Persian troops. I don't mean half in a literal sense, it was more of an exaggeration, but they took so much more of the Persians than they themselves had casualties, including the 10,000 immortals, which were the top tier warriors of the Persian army. They didn't stand a fighting chance against the Spartans in the close combat type of environment they were in. They just weren't well enough equipped to handle the Spartans and their military experience that they brought to the table. Eventually, nearing the end of the battle, Leonidas was killed, and he didn't go down without the amazing fight. It was said that even after he broke his sword, he fought with his hands and teeth to kill any Persian he could. After they were surrounded, about 700 Greek citizens from another Greek city-state stayed with them and fought with them until they were captured. And they made a final stand against the Persians, the 300 of the Spartans and the other Grecians who stayed with them. But they fought till the absolute end, put everything they had into this battle, and to show his discontent with Leonidas and how much he hated Leonidas, he ended up beheading him after the battle and putting on a stake, which was against every rule and law of the time. But eventually, Leonidas' body was recovered by the Spartans very much later on, and they gave it a proper burial. And where they gave it that burial, they put this monument there to memorialize him in his great fight that he put up. On it is a Greek phrase that Leonidas was famous for saying. The Persian king Xerxes asked if the Spartans would just lay down their weapons and give up. And he responded with, "Come and take them," roughly, which is on the bottom marble part of the statue. And that's what has been memorialized of him there in that Spartan memorial / museum that they have there in Sparta. So for Leonidas's legacy, he really did not reign for that long. It was only about 10 years, and most of it was spent during warring times, or times where tensions were extremely high and had to be very careful and always watchful about what happened. He had one son, and his name was Pleistarchus, and he was actually too young to be an effective ruler when his father died. So his uncle, which was also related to him in another way because of the relationship his father Leonidas and his mother had, ruled for him for quite a while. He was a regent ruler, meaning they took the place of him and ruled in place of him. But his legacy also lived on in other ways. He's been memorialized and remembered in many different films, books, a bunch of different poems, even, where they remember his courage and bravery him and his 300 Spartans took in the Battle of Thermopylae to go and buy time for the rest of the Greek city-states to mount an attack against the Persians and to ultimately defeat them in the end. And it wouldn't have been possible without him and his group of 300. So he's lived on in even our modern day world. Everyone knows of him. It's common knowledge. And I think that's pretty spectacular that someone's name could live on like that for this long. So these are my works cited pages. The first couple are my JSTOR articles that I found. They gave different explanations of the Battle of Thermopylae and just quick information about different things of Leonidas and basic information about him. A couple of the other ones were the histories of Herodotus. That was actually one of the first person to write about Leonidas. He made a complete list of the rulers of Sparta, all the different kings. He was the first person to do that. And it was actually about 20 years after Leonidas' death that he wrote that, because he was only 4 years old at the time that Leonidas died. And then I just had a couple of other sources that I found provided really good information about this, different things that I used and presented in this presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something new, something interesting from hearing this. Thank you for your time.